Welcome. My name is Lori Fuller, and thank you for joining me today for another episode of ARTMade. And today's painting is inspired by a photograph. And inspiration can come from many places depending on the artist. Sometimes artists are inspired by color combinations that they see on a walk, and sometimes artists are inspired and bring their art supplies on a hike, and sometimes they set their art supplies up and decide to paint plein air, which means they are responding to maybe a beautiful waterfall, and they're painting the sounds that they hear and the colors and in the landscape. Well, my painting today is inspired by a photograph, and the photograph is actually taken by my sister who lives in Southern California. So I want to show you the photograph and why I'm inspired to paint this. So my sister lives very close to the beach, and she sent me this photo of two seagulls. And if you look closely, one of the seagulls actually has just one leg. But I really enjoy the composition that's on this photograph. I can see that the composition is not cut straight in half. It's actually cut at an angle, and you can see some of the water here at the top. And if you look closely, you can see some of the waves. And then, of course, the bottom part is all the wet sand. And then we have two seagulls that are kind of sitting there or standing there and looking at more waves and enjoying the scenery. So we have one that's in the background that's a little bit smaller, and one that's up close that's a little bit larger. So when I took this photo, or took the photo and I enlarged it, and I found my composition. So I really like this, that the seagulls are a little bit larger and they are more the center of the composition. So I used this and maybe some of the colors, and I added more colors, and I also focused a little bit on the footprints that's in the side of this picture. And so I used this picture and to paint the painting that we're going to work with today. So you can see that I pulled a little bit from the sunset that's kind of reflecting on the ocean water. And we also used a lot of colors for the sand. So there's a lot of techniques that we're going to go through today, including a wet technique and then a dry brush technique, and then we're going to add the seagulls at the very end. So we're going to keep this handy, and we're going to work our way through our painting. So today, I want to talk a little bit about the supplies that we're going to be using. We are going to be using an 8x10 canvas, and so this is a stretch canvas, and you can, and I like to use this type of canvas because when I get my picture painted, I will paint on the outside edge and it's ready for hanging. Today we're also going to be using acrylic paint, and I have a lot of different colors, and we're going to be mixing quite a few colors for our landscape painting. And then I've got just 3 brush sizes that we're going to use, and I have a large flat brush, and this is what I'm going to start with. And then I've got more of a rounded tip brush that we're going to add the colors. And then I have a smaller brush that we add to the details. And for this painting, I'm actually going to work large and all the way down to the smaller. So this is going to be the last brush that I'm going to use. So for this painting, on the photograph, you can see that there's a lot of blue in here. So we're going to do what we call an underpainting. So we're going to paint the top half a light blue and the bottom half a darker blue, and then we're going to layer the colors on top. Now with acrylic paint, that's very easy because the paint dries fairly quickly, and we're going to use a dry brush mark as we get and layer all the colors. One thing to keep in mind for today's painting is that the direction of your brush marks. So you want to make sure that we're going from left to right or right to left, and we're not going to follow this angle. I know when I did my practice painting and I was at first inspired, if I did not keep my brush marks equal, it started to look like a sky, and it didn't keep with that idea that this is a wet sand, dry sand in it, parts of the ocean. So when we're going to begin, we're going to start with this diagonal line that you see on the photograph. I have my paper plate that's ready, and I have a cobalt blue, which is a very light blue. I've got my white paint that is going to use to lighten my cobalt blue, and then I've got a very dark blue, which is more of a Prussian blue. And if you don't have this in your color palette, you can make this fairly easy by taking a regular blue and adding a lot of black and maybe a little bit of touch of red. So then I've got my water cup that's going to be used to clean my brushes, and then I've got some napkins to dry off. So again, I'm going to start with my large brush. I'm going to get this wet in my water, And then I'm going to squeeze out the excess. I just want a damp brush to start with this process. And I'm going to start now with mixing the light blue, which is the top half. So I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to pull in just a little bit of blue, and I'm going to cover both sides of my brush with just a little bit. And now I'm just going to pick up a large chunk of white, the white acrylic, a little bit on both sides, and now I'm going to start brushing. And I'm going to keep my brush marks going from left to right or right to left. And for this painting, it doesn't need to fill the entire space because we're going to be layering a lot of our colors. So I've got a nice start here with some white and some blue. And now I'm just going to mix my colors right on the canvas. I'm just going to pick up some white, and I'm going to use my whole arm, and I'm just going to go across the canvas. And I'm going to keep that diagonal line because I like that diagonal line. It keeps a lot of interest into the final painting, even this composition as well. Now where I'm going to come in and pick up some blue paint, I'm not going to pick up a whole lot because I want to keep this fairly light. So I'm just going to come in and just brush it. And I'm not even going to smooth the whole thing out. Maybe I'm just going to add some more up here at the white. And again, this is just the underpainting, and the reason why I decided to do the underpainting is because when you look at the photograph, you can see the highlights or low tones of blue that's embedded into the sand, dark down here, light up here. So I'm going to keep moving. If you notice that the paint starts to dry out a little bit on your brush, you just need to pick up a little bit more paint. And because we're trying to keep this very light, I'm just going to pick up a little bit of blue and a lot of white. I can always put more white on my palette. And I'm not going to clean out my brush until I'm done with all of the blue underpainting. I'm going to add just a little bit of water, dab it off a little bit, and kind of spread this out a little bit so I make sure I'm going over the edge. And when it's all said and done and all my painting is complete, I'm actually going to take some brown and go around the outside edge, and that will serve as my frame. Okay, we got a little bit of the diagonal done here at the top. I'm going to lighten this up just a little bit. So I'm going to take the extra paint off my brush. And I'm going to wipe it off the napkin, and I'm just going to go in and pick up some white. And acrylic paint's going to dry fairly quickly, so you want to make sure that you have the light areas all filled in before moving to the dark. Okay, that's looking very good. And now I'm going to I'm not going to clean out my brush, I'm just going to take the dark Prussian blue and I'm going to load up both sides of my brush. And I'm going to take the edge and I'm going to just start to draw that diagonal line in there. All right, now I'm going to come in and pick up a little bit more, and I'm going to start filling in this space. And again, I'm going to keep my brush marks going from left to right or right to left, and I'm just going to keep going until I run out of paint on my brush. And you can come in and pick up just a little bit of white to lighten that up just a little bit. But we want this second portion to be fairly dark. Almost looks too dark, but we're going to lighten that up when we add more dry brush marks over the top once this painting is dry. Pick up a little bit of white there. We almost have this area complete. And it's okay if you don't fill up the entire space. That's fine, because we're going to layer quite a few colors on the top of this to get more of the color of the sand. Maybe just a little bit more. Again, keeping your brush marks going horizontal or from left to right to left. All right, so we've filled up the first layer with the underpainting. And what I want to do now is I want to focus on this actual line right here and how it's kind of it's a jagged line, and that's where the water is coming up on the sand. Right now on my painting, I don't have that fine-tuned just quite yet. So I'm going to put this brush aside, and now I'm going to pick up my next brush, and I'm going to get the brush wet, take the extra water out, and now I'm just going to come in and I'm going to pick up some white. Even if some of my palettes already kind of mixed a little bit of white with the blue, that's fine. And I'm just going to get a nice edge on there, and now I'm just going to take my brush, and I'm just going to barely touch the surface just to get a nice blurred, almost jagged line. You can tell where the water is kind of coming into the part of the sand. And clean that brush off and maybe come in with a little bit of dark. And you can always add more detail to this line later on. And when I use this flat brush right here, I like to put a little bit of paint on both sides, and then I use my brush and make sure that that it's a pretty thin line and all the bristles are going in one direction. So I'm going to come back in here and just add just some feather. And maybe go over this edge just a little bit, because that's all going to be covered up, and I want to make sure I've got a nice uniform color. So we have the first part of our painting done, and I'm just going to take my brush and I'm going to put it in the water and clean that up. So again, for the first part, we have the underpainting, and this is a little bit of blue and a white. I used a cobalt blue, but sometimes a primary blue or even a sky blue would work very well. And then this bottom part is a Prussian blue. You can also mix that again by mixing a little bit of blue and a little bit of black. And now we want to wait until this dries. Acrylic paint usually dries fairly quickly. So while that's drying, let's take a look at our photograph to see what's next. So I have the finished painting here. And I followed this same process already. So our next step is to actually come in and add some of the sunset colors that's reflecting on the water. So if you look at the photograph, and I wanted to keep that, what I see on the photograph, I see a lot of pink, a lot of peach, a little bit of that blue still showing through, so I'm not going to paint the entire surface over again. And a little bit of maybe a little bit of purple, a little bit of white, and of course we've got the part of the edge of the ocean waves that are coming in. So we're going to do this part first, and then we're going to come back in and we're going to add the colors for the sand. Now when I went to look at the photograph, the sand was a little bit dark, and I decided that I wanted to lighten that up just a little bit in my final piece. So I kept in with a little bit of the browns, a little bit of the peach on the bottom, and then of course the very last part I did was the seagulls and the footprints here. All right, so it looks like our very top part of our area is clean and dry, and so now we're ready to add some of those beautiful sunset colors. So I'm using just a paper plate, and I have a part of my paper plate, I've got the blues, and I'm going to keep those because I might come back in and add some of those later on. And now I'm going to figure out how to add the pink and the peach. So when I go to mix my colors of paint, I don't usually, when I go to buy my acrylic paint, I don't buy peach paint or I don't buy pink paint. I like to mix my colors. So for the pink, I'm going to use a little bit of red, and you don't need a whole lot because this next technique is called the dry brush technique. And what we're going to do is just a little bit of paint, and we're going to just brush it into the surface and start layering. So I've got a little bit of the red. And to make pink, you need a little bit of red, a little bit of white. So I've got my white paint here. And I'm just going to make a fresh pile because I have some white with my blue, and now I'm just going to make a fresh pile for my pink. Peach paint is made by mixing a little bit of orange and a little bit of red, a little bit of white, and sometimes I like to add just a little bit of lavender to make that. I'm also, this time I'm going to be using a little bit of different kind of yellow, and this is called Naples yellow, so I'm just going to use that instead and try to make a little bit of my own orange. And I think I've already got a little bit of blue and the red to make the purple. So now I'm going to take a clean brush. I'm going to make sure I clean my brush out on the water. And then you can change water as many times as you want. I found for this painting it's easier if you keep a nice clean extra glass of water to clean your brush out. And I'm going to use a very dry brush, so I want to make sure I get most of that moisture out of my brush. And now I'm going to take my palette and I'm going to start making pink. And pink is made by mixing a little bit of red and a little bit of white. So I'm going to take my brush, and I'm using my smaller brush. I went from large to small. And I'm going to load it up with white, move it to a different pile. And this pink here is very, very, very light. So I'm just going to come in and just pick up just a very small amount of red. And I'm going to mix that right in on my palette. Remember, it's easier to go with a little bit of red. You can always make it a little bit darker. And it's a lot harder to go from too dark of red to white because you'll use a lot more of your white paint up. So now I'm just going to test this out on my painting, and I'm going to load up both sides of my brush. And for this, I like to, I'm going to use what I have on my photograph, and you're going to make sure that all of the lines that you use are going from left to right or right to left, or what they're called horizontal lines. So I'm going to take my brush, and I want to make sure that my canvas is dry, and I'm going to start applying the paint on the surface of the canvas, and I'm just going to keep on going until my paint is all gone. There's nothing left on there, and I'm going to come in and pick up some more. And maybe I'm going to make it just a little bit more, and I'm going to make this one just a little bit more red. So I'm going to pick in just a little bit of that red paint, and I'm going to mix it in there. And I'm going to apply that right here. And I'm not going to cover the whole surface, right? I'm just going to go back and forth and just add the highlights, because what this really is it's reflecting the sunset or the sunrise that's it's in the sky. And I'm not going to add any water to my paint because I want to keep that dry brush. I want to keep going back and forth until I have just the marks, just the reflection that's in that water. Now I'm going to make a little bit of peach. So when you go to make peach, you're going to make your red and add that, and add just a little bit of that yellow, and I'm going to mix that into this pile here. And that's makes a little bit of a peach already, and now I'm going to come in with a little bit of white. And I'm going to load up both sides of my brush, and I'm going to start adding those colors in there next. And this is a little bit of a time-consuming part with this part of the painting, but this is also the fun part where you can start in and, maybe you're going to go away from the photograph and just start playing with some of the colors that you see. That's a real pretty color. Now, I'm not going to wash my brush this whole process until I probably get closer to the bottom, because I want to make sure that my brush is blending right into the top part of that underpainting. So now I'm going to come in and maybe mix a little bit more. Make this a little bit darker. So I'm loading up both sides of my brush, and now I'm going to come in and add that. Now, if this is a little bit too dark, for me it's a little bit too dark, I'm just going to come in and pick up a little bit of white and blend that right in. So I'm just going to keep on painting here, and you can practice mixing your colors as well. And we're going to keep on going until we have a nice color that we're happy with that's going to reflect a lot of what's in that sky. We almost got that corner done, almost got enough color that I'm happy with it. I'm going to keep a lot of that blue because I want that to be the underpainting. I want to keep a little bit of that hinting through. And we're going to add the ocean waves at the very end so we can all layer, we can layer all of that near the end. Now I'm just going to pick up a little bit of this beautiful peach color and add a little bit of white to it. And I'm almost got a little bit too much paint on my brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an extra napkin here and I'm just going to clean my brush. Not going to wipe it or with water or clean it with water, but I'm just going to make sure I get all that extra paint out. Now I'm going to pick up some of that fresh color and I'm going to load up both sides. And add some more of that little bit of a feather. Okay, got that very top part done. And we can always come back in later and add more color as we get to working on the sand and the seagulls. So we have the nice light peaches and pink in there and a little bit of blue that's still showing through from the underpainting. So now we're going to move to the sand color. And when I looked at the photograph, and like I mentioned before, that this is a little bit too dark, and what I wanted to do is to lighten that up a little bit and add some texture to the sand. So in my final painting, what I did is I kept all my brush marks going horizontal from left to right or right to left, and then I came back in and added a little bit of splatter. And after I found the color of sand that I was fairly happy with, I went on top and then painted my seagull. So this is all going to be layered. You don't need to worry about keeping the seagull free. We're going to actually paint on top of what we've already painted. So now let's work on the sand color. I like on this final painting how you can see some of the blue that's underneath, which really resembles the wet sand. So we want to make sure we keep on that. So for this part, I'm going to use some I'm going to keep using the Naples yellow, and now I'm going to come back in and add maybe a little bit of burnt sienna to my palette. I'm going to put a little bit on my palette here. And I want to use, let's see, a little bit of burnt raw umber, which is almost like a dark brown. So I have a reddish brown and a dark brown that I'm going to use. And I might still use a little bit of the pinks and a little bit of the purples and a little bit of the other colors too. So I'm going to clean my brush out. And I'm going to get all of the moisture out of my paintbrush. I'm going to use the same brush as I had before. We're only using 3 brushes for this entire painting. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to use my yellow, and I'm going to pull it aside. And I'm going to add just a little bit of the burnt sienna, which is almost like a reddish brown, almost a little bit of an orange brown. And now I'm going to add just maybe a little bit of the raw sienna, which is more of a darker brown. And then just going to keep mixing, maybe a little bit of red, to see what kind of color we get. I know that every time that I paint sand, I always use a different color combination, and I just like to play around with color and find the different colors that might work. So now I've got a little bit of a kind of maybe a little bit more brown in there. It's looking like a nice color. I'm just actually going to use just a little bit of the blue to and a little bit more brown, and there, and a little bit there. All right, so now I'm going to clean my brush, get those extra colors out, and now I'm going to get all the extra moisture out of my brush, and now I'm going to pick this up, load both sides of my brush, and maybe a little bit more of the yellow, and now I'm going to start on the wet sand. And it's the same process. My brush is I'm just going to keep moving my brush across the canvas until I run out of paint. And I'm going to go in a horizontal, left from right or right to left. And it's no rhyme or reason where this is all going to start. I'm just going to start filling up the paint. So now I don't have hardly any paint left on my brush. Now I'm going to come back in and just pick up some burnt sienna, which is again like a reddish brown. And maybe I'll just put a little bit down here in this corner here. And maybe I'm going to pick up a little bit of the burnt umber or raw umber. And I'm not going to fill up the entire space because I want those blue underpaintings to show. Oh, that's a beautiful color. I like that. I like that against the blue. That's really pretty. And you don't want this area to be too dark in the corner because we're going to add some footprints when it's all, once the paint is dry. Now I'm going to come back in and maybe make a little bit of peach like I did before with the sand, and I'm just going to keep it a little dark because this is a dark area here. We want to make sure that it's starting to have that sand-like color. Add just a little bit of white to my brush, get the extra paint off. And I think I'll pick up a little bit of that dark brown and add some little white to it. Lighten that up just a little bit, and I've got a lot of paint on my brush. I'm just going to take a little bit of that off. And that's a pretty color too. And make sure I get this area down here. And a little bit of red, a little bit of white. Takes a lot of layers before it starts to blend in and looks more like sand. I think the original painting that I did and showed you earlier, it has probably about 7 or 8 layers of just paint, dry brush marks going over the top. Now if you look at this painting right here, I've got this area, that line, that sharp diagonal line that needs a lot of attention because right now it's still very blue. So I think I'm going to come in with light and a little bit of yellow, a little bit of the brown, and maybe a little bit of red to make them more of a peach color. More brown here. There we go. Some white. Get the extra paint off my brush, and I'm going to load up my brush on both sides. And still using just the edge of my brush here. Turn my... Doesn't need to be perfect because this is just that diagonal line. That's where the wet sand is meeting part of the ocean. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of water. And I really want to come in and add some of those dark areas here. And notice that I haven't washed my brush yet. I'm just going to use all the paint that's in my brush and just keep layering and layering and layering until I'm pretty happy with the color of the sand. You can always add more details later. Especially after we get the seagulls done, you can always add more layers and more depth of color. I think this area right here could use a little bit of that reddish brown. Almost done. Come back in and really add some of that. There we go. That's a better color. Okay. I think I like that color. I've got some lots of Naples yellow, a little bit of white areas, some light, really light areas. We got a little bit on the bottom here that probably needs a little bit of attention. And pick that up real quick. Trying to keep with that horizontal lines, dry brush marks. You can still see a lot of that Prussian blue or that dark blue that's kind of coming in underneath. really resembles some sand. Now I want to have little bit of fun, and I'm going to do some splattering and add a little bit more texture to that. So I'm going to take my smaller brush, and I'm going to add a lot of water, and maybe I'm going to come in with just some yellow here, the Naples yellow, and I'm going to make it really kind of soupy. I'm just going to mix it until I have a nice color. You can always test it out on a napkin to make sure you've got a nice amount of color. And now I've got it loaded up, my brush loaded up, and now we're going to add some splatter. So I'm just going to take my brush and I'm just going to tap it. And if you get some in the sky, that's okay, but you can always wipe that up. And a little bit more. And I'm going to add maybe a little bit of white here. Okay, yeah, just a little bit more yellow. And I'm going to take a napkin and wipe up just a little bit of that. Oops. And it's got too big of a splatter right there. I'm going to blend out a little bit, blend that out just a little bit. Okay, so I've did an underpainting with the light blue, an underpainting with the dark blue, and now I used a dry brush mark or a dry brush technique and added layers and layers of colors. We have quite a few layers of color over here, and now we are ready for the next step. And I have this one that's all ready to go. So the next step is to figure out, and I did this exact same process with this canvas here. So the next step is to figure out where you want the seagulls to be. And I have found an easy, kind of a sneaky kind of way to figure out the placement of where I would like the birds. We're using the photo here as an inspiration, but we can actually just draw the seagulls as large as we want or small as we want and place as many as we want on there. So instead of drawing on the canvas and erasing and drawing and erasing and every time you erase you're going to pick up a little bit of your color, I actually took another piece of paper and I drew the seagulls as a step-by-step. And if you're interested in learning how to draw the seagulls, and you would like a copy of the step-by-steps, you can send me an email at the end of the video and I can give you the step-by-step and make the process a little bit easier. So I drew the seagulls on another piece of paper and I cut them out, and then I tried to figure out different arrangements that were on my canvas. So I ended up tracing over my own drawing, and so you can see here as I used a pencil and a little bit of the darker areas, this is where I want to keep my seagulls. And so I'm going to draw the entire bird, and I'm going to keep this bird down here. It's a one-legged seagull. I'm going to keep it with one leg in the final piece. So I just used again a piece of paper and drew my seagulls, cut them out, placed them on tried different areas or different arrangements on my canvas, and when I was happy with the results, I traced over my own drawing, and so now you can see where my two seagulls are. Now, because the seagulls in the photo are white and black, we're actually going to use a very similar layering technique, and we're going to paint the entire seagull white, and then we're going to come back in and add the darker areas with the black paint for the wings and of course the dot for the eyes. So I'm actually going to take my white paint and going to make a fresh space in my paper plate. And for this I'm using what we call a heavy body acrylic. And the reason why I want to use a heavy body is that there's a little bit less, it's a thicker paint, it's got less water, and it's actually going to layer a lot easier on top of dark paint. So anytime that you have a dark paint and you use a very thin white paint or even a yellow paint, it's going to take several layers of paint. With a heavy body, just like I have here, it's going to be able to do that all in one layer. So now I'm going to clean out my brush, and I'm going to clean it out very well because I'm going to go using white paint. And if you don't clean out your brush, you're going to end up with a pink or an orange or peach color seagull. And I'm going to clean that up, and my paintbrush is damp, and I'm just going to go straight into my paint. And I'm going to load up both sides. Again, this is more of a detailed brush. And I'm going to paint the first layer, and I'm going to paint the entire bird. And I'm going to go straight to the line. And you can tell, like the heavy body, you see how well that's showing up over the dark wet sand. And don't be afraid to keep going back and forth and picking up a lot of paint, because it's going to, we want that seagull to really show up against that dark wet sand. And the whiter that your paint is, or the brighter your paint is, the easier that bird is going to show up. And I'm not adding any water. I'm painting straight from the paint. No color mixing here. And I'm really just following my own outline here. And I'm going to paint that beak too. And I'm going to come back in with a yellowish color when that's dry. I got the first one done. Let's work on the second. If you've got some really fine areas you need to get with your brush, you may have to clean your brush off and just add just a tiny little bit of water to your paint to make it a little bit easier to spread. I try not to add a lot with the water because I want that bright white, as much bright white as we can. Okay, we got a good start here. We can always add more white. And I think we're at a very good place here to start with the darker color for the wings. I'm actually going to add just a little bit of water to get a nice edge here on the white for the belly of the seagull. There. Okay, I'm going to clean my brush off, and if you look at the photograph, we're going to now pick up a little bit of black for the wings. We're not going to paint the entire wing all black because there's a little bit of a stripes on this one and a little bit of stripe on this one, but we're going to do a majority of that with the black. So I'm going to get some black paint, but just a little bit on my palette. You don't need a whole lot because black is a very dark color, and you won't need a whole lot of it. Now, because that white paint isn't dry, it may take a couple of layers to get to the, use some my brushes, some of my paints around so I can use my photo as a reference. So I'm going to come in and pick up some black. I'm going to load up both sides of my brush. I don't want too much paint on there because I want to get a nice edge. And let's do the first bird up here. And it looks like, according to the photo, just going to kind of outline it. We got a line right here, and his wing kind of comes down here, almost to the belly. It's going to go over the top. You see how that white paint's not dry yet, which is fine because there's going to be some dark areas on the wing and some lighter areas, so it's going to mix a gray, which is fine. And I'm going to come back in, and I'm just going to use the very tip of my brush to get the edge of the tail. Alright. Okay, so there's part of the wing, and I'm going to let that dry and we can add another layer. I'm actually going to keep this little part here white, just as it is in my photo, and I want to make that tail just a little bit longer. There we go. And I'm going to let that dry, and I can add some more. See what happens if you add more black? It starts to get a little bit darker. And maybe our little brush marks here maybe help make that, just do smaller brush marks, make that kind of look like feathers on the bird. I'm going to clean up my brush because when it mixed, it's actually mixed and made a gray. So I'm going to clean up my brush, and I'm going to start on the wing of this second seagull. I'll load up with black, and according to the photo, it looks like we're going to come down here about like this and bring in some of that. Again, that paint's still wet, that's why it's mixing in to make gray, which is fine because we can still layer a lot of dark color on top of that. I'll load up my brush from both sides and like that, come out there, yeah. All right, so I'm going to let that dry, and then we can add more black on top. Now, if you take a look at the photograph, if you take a look at this photo, there's a little bit of gray that kind of outlines the back edge of the seagull's head here and a little bit here. That helps create a little bit of depth. So I want to make sure that I add that to my seagulls. So I'm going to clean out my brush while I'm waiting on these wings to dry. And clean out, and now I'm going to come in and I'm actually going to mix a little bit of my gray. So I'm going to take my white and I'm going to put it into a pile because I want to keep that white as I can, and I'm just going to make gray into a little pile. So I'm going to pull my white paint over into another little section of my paper plate. And I don't want a very dark gray. I want this to be super light because the seagull's head is not gray. It's actually white, but this is like more or less like the shadow that helps create that three-dimensional look. So I'm going to just take my brush and I'm just going to barely dip into that black. Just very, very, very. And there I've already mixed a little bit of gray. That almost looks like the perfect color. So let's test it. I'm going to take a look at my photo, and I'm going to fill in with this bird right here, this back edge, just to create a little bit of depth. So I've got the gray on my brush, and I'm going to use my reference photo as a guide, and I'm just going to come back in and add just a little bit of that gray. Maybe a tiny little bit more black. Make a little bit more of a darker gray, and add some white. There we go. And just going to blend that right in because that's already still wet from the first layer of paint. I'm going to do the same to the second bird right here, just on that back side of it, the back part of it. I've added a little bit of gray. Now I'm just going to blend it. I'm going to clean off my brush a little bit and then pick up some straight white, and I'm going to blend that in. So, oops, got a little bit too much paint on my brush there. There we go. There we go. Just enough to give it a little bit of, adding a little bit of depth, and I'm going to do the same down here to the belly of this seagull here. And it looks like on this bird near the top, it's got a little bit of darkness here, a little bit of gray on this belly. Okay, so while I'm waiting on the wings to dry, that dark area, I'm going to come back in and I'm going to fill in the beak. So I'm going to clean off my brush, and I'm going to go right to the Naples yellow. And I'm going to, just to see what that color looks like on the beak of the bird. So I'm just going to use, again, I'm not using the same brush, cleaned it out, and now I'm going to pick up some of that yellow and going to, let's do this first bird here. Now, seagulls have a little bit of a long beak, so I'm going to bring that out just a little bit on this one. And I'm going to pick the same color here. I'm going to always looking back and forth at my reference photo. And maybe a little bit of white as you get a little bit closer to. There we go. I like that. So now I think what I will do now is I will clean out my brush, and I'm going to add the eye. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit of black. And what I do is, because I don't want to, press too hard and make a gigantic eye on the seagull, I always practice a little bit on my newsprint to make sure that I can get a nice small circle, because you don't like, this is just a tiny bird. It doesn't have really large eyes. Okay, so I'm going to come in and just very small. Yep, there's the first one. Let's come in here. I'm going to pick up a little bit more of the black, try again on my newsprint, and add the second. There we go. And while I've had the black on my brush, I'm going to come back in and add some more, another layer of dark here on this bird. And I'm just using really small brush marks on here to kind of resemble, help that resemble a little bit of like the feathers. This one here is because it's up close. It's going to be very important that we get that wing a little bit darker. So I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to, again, small brush marks. And it may take a little while for this to dry, but we're going to build up the color as best we can. You can see how I'm holding my brush. It's more like a pencil. A lot different than when I was doing the dry brush technique. So now I'm going to come back in and do these feathers here. Okay, we're getting closer to the finish line, so now we have our seagulls. And now if you look at this painting right here, the legs don't show up very well. So I want to take a look at the photo to figure out what color I probably should use for the legs, and best way for those to make sure that they're showing up in the final painting. So if you look at this seagull right here, it's got a very light leg with a little bit of dark over the top, and it got a nice horizontal line. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean out my brush, and I'm going to paint the leg first in light, almost like a white, and then I'm going to come back in and add a little bit of dark over the top. So I'm going to take my white paint and add just a little bit of water to make sure it's a little bit, it can spread the paint. Sometimes with the use of thicker paint, it's a little bit, because it has less liquid into the pigment, it's a little bit harder to spread. And I've got it already drawn here, my guidelines, and I'm just going to take this and I'm going to take my brush and I'm just going to bring it down. And again, that's going to have a little bit of darkness over the top to help make that look a little bit 3D. And for this, I'm just going to maybe pick up a little bit of brown and then mix that with my brush. And there we go. I want to let that dry, and I'm going to come in and paint a little bit more of a brown and white for the bird right here. Add some water to my brush. Maybe a little bit of yellow and some white. Okay, so this is actually going to go down. And there you go. And I'm going to draw the other leg here with my brush. Okay, so now that that is dried, this down here is dry, I'm going to add the dark areas. I'm just going to come back in with that really dark brown, like that dark umber, and load my brush up here. Maybe add just a little bit of water to help that smooth that out and make it easier to spread. And I'm just going to come back in and paint. And a little bit of black too. So this shows up a little bit. And some white over the top of that. I almost got that a little bit too dark. We'll let that dry and add just a little bit of white over the top. All right, so now we're going to work while that's drying. We're going to add some of the waves that are coming in on the corner here. So I'm just going to take my brush, clean it up the best I can, and I'm just going to pick up a lot of white paint. And I want the waves to kind of come in from the side here. Lay that paint on fairly thick. There we go. I'm just going to use like a circular motion too, because that's kind of like the waves that are going to come in. It's going to be rolling in. All right, and so now what I want to do is add some of the last minute details and add some of these lines here. That's all going to go horizontal to add a little bit of that texture. And then the very last part is I'm going to put some footprints out here in the corner. So this texture here looks like it's going to come back in like almost like a blue-gray. So I've got a lot of colors still on my palette. I don't need any more paint. I'm just going to wash my brush out. And I'm going to make a blue-gray, which is a little bit of the blue. I'm going to use the light blue here. And I'm going to mix my white. Add just a tiny little bit of black. That's almost too much. And you've got a nice blue-gray color. And I'm just going to water this down just a little bit because I don't want this to be very definite. I just want to add just a little bit of texture. So I'm just going to come back in here and just like brush it a little bit. Maybe a little bit more blue. There we go. And maybe a little bit up here at the top. And I'm just using like some really nervous lines. And now I want to put a little bit of a reflection on this bird, especially since it's in the water. So I'm going to wash out my brush. And I'm not going to take a lot of the water out. I'm just going to maybe mix a little bit of the burnt sienna and a little bit of the blue. And I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to add some marks here to make it look like it's a reflection. Now this leg here on this bird needs a little bit of attention, so I think it's a little bit dry enough for us to come back in and fix that color up a little bit. So I'm just going to mix that. There we go. And maybe make that a little bit yellow. There. Okay, and now we're going to take the bird footprints, and I'm just going to go straight with the burnt umber, and I'm just going to draw those up here in the corner. I don't want it to be super dark because it's just an imprint in the sand, so I'm just going to draw a little bit darker than that. Okay. And then maybe a little bit of darker, make that just a little bit darker. There we go. Maybe there's a little bit coming in on this corner here. All right, so we're almost done. We're going to let this dry just a little bit and add a little bit more of the ocean waves, but it's getting very close to our original painting. I have some ocean waves right here, and now I'm just going to work on finishing those up. It takes a little bit of while for the thicker paint to dry. So I'm going to come back in and highlight a little bit of these waves here. I'm going to with that blue-gray. So I'm going to take my blue and some white and some black and make a nice blue-gray and come back with the thinner paint here. And there you go. Mix some white over the top of that. I'm just going to layer some of those colors. There we go. Okay, now we have a finished painting. And if once the paint dries, maybe it's going to dry just a little bit lighter. If you wanted to come back in and add more colors, you can always work around the birds and add more layers and colors to get your beach painting to have a little bit more depth. But so anyway, if you'd like a copy of the step-by-step on how to draw the seagull to help you with the birds and the outline of the birds, just send me an email and I can send you the step-by-step, and then you can be on your way to painting some more happy seagulls. So thank you for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll see you next time.